Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on applying trauma-informed practices to work with youth in the VR setting. My name is Jessica, and I'm a YTAC team member. Before we begin, let's go over a few things. On the top right-hand corner, you're able to download our PowerPoint presentation at any time during this webinar. Right below that is our links pod, where you'll be able to see our evaluation. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take about 5 minutes to complete this right after the webinar. It helps us ensure that we're providing high quality training and technical assistance. Right below that is the Q&A box. Feel free to ask your questions there to our presenters. And on the bottom right-hand corner, participate in conversation with everyone else. Okay, so that's it. I hope you enjoy this webinar. And
thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon and welcome everybody. We are so excited to have all of you joining us as we get to share some time with one of our subject matter experts today, Aideen Carhan, where we're talking about applying trauma-informed practices to our work with youth in the vocational rehabilitation or VR setting. Got to remember that I got to advance the slide. Aideen is, like I said, one of our subject matter experts, and she is actually employed at Cornell University at their Yang Tan Institute on Employment and Disability. She's an extension associate on one of their projects regarding transition in New York State. She's got 20 years of experience in social work, where her main emphasis was on the child and families. She also has her own private practice. At the end of the webinar, there will be a slide that pops up as well as a link where you can complete our evaluation of today's webinar. It's really essential that we get feedback from you, not only in the quality of our work, but in how useful the information is and what additional information and or training you may be seeking on this topic or in similar topics. So we highly encourage you to stay connected with us until the end of the webinar at 3:30 p.m. Eastern so that you can complete the evaluation. This is especially important if you are a vocational rehabilitation counselor who does have your CRC and you want to submit to get the CRCs that have been approved for this webinar. And the instructions on this slide tell you that after the webinar, which you must stay for the entirety, and you complete the evaluation, you will contact Jessica, and her information is here, with your full legal name in order to request the form so that you can get your certificate of completion. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about what the Vocational Rehabilitation Youth Technical Assistance Center is, and we refer to it as YTAC. We are led by the Institute for Educational Leadership in Washington, D.C., through their Center for Workforce Development, and it has several partners, one of which is Cornell University. I am an employee of Cornell, and I'm also a technical assistance liaison that works directly with state voc rehab agencies and their partner agencies. We also have other partners through Boston University to help us with evaluation and data, as well as many subject matters similar to Aideen across the country. The Institute for Educational Leadership is in DC, and they really work to help build capacity in terms of leadership, employment, workforce, building futures for our children and youth with disabilities, and looking at equity. Many of you have probably seen a lot of their products if you're familiar with the 411 on disability disclosure that came out of IEL, for those of you who may know or use that resource. Some of the key services that we provide as a National Technical Assistance Center are really working, like I said, with the state voc rehab agencies and their partner agencies, including schools and nonprofits, to really help and engage with youth that we consider to be opportunity youth, youth with disabilities who may be in the foster care system, in the juvenile justice system. They may be youth with disabilities who have dropped out of school. They may be youth with disabilities who have reached the maximum age of eligibility and they're not engaged in any additional education, training, or employment after high school and up to the age of 25. They could also be teens who have or are experiencing homelessness, pregnant teens, teen parents. Oftentimes, because of their varied situations, they're not tapped into the various resources that are available to them, and we really work together to build partnerships and interagency collaboration to ensure that our students in these populations are getting engaged with services so that they can become employed. We are one of 5 national technical assistance centers that really do focus on youth and students. Our other partner agencies, many of you may have heard of WINTAC, which is the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center, and they work a lot around WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, and things that are policy and regulation related. So those of you that know about pre-employment transition services or PREETs or Section 511 subminimum wage, that's in their wheelhouse. We also partner with the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, which we refer to as NTACT, which has a very heavy education focus, but lots with interagency collaboration with VR and other partners as well. The Promise Technical Assistance Center was an initiative through Social Security where there were grants that were provided to competing states to work with youth and students with disabilities that are receiving SSI, working with them and their families to look at the benefits of working and providing supports to help them make that transition to employment. And then as well, the National Collaborative Workforce and Disability out of IEL that I've already mentioned. So with all of that being said, I'm really excited to have Aideen with us today, and she's going to take it from here. Aideen?
Hi, thanks, Kim. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm really excited to be talking with you today on behalf of the YTech. This is a topic that's been kind of close to my heart as a social worker and a mental health practitioner. My work in the field started out with working with youth in foster care and youth who had been adopted, and there was just a lot of early childhood trauma, and then kind of went from there in terms of applying that trauma lens to various populations. And I think this is a really important approach because trauma-informed care it's a way of viewing things. It's kind of a paradigm shift away from the more medical model that viewed individuals through the lens of labels and sometimes just negative ways of describing people. And it looks at how we can be more strength-based. It looks at how we can create feelings of safety. And what we're going to be talking about today in terms of trauma is actually it's psychological and emotional safety and trauma related to psychological trauma. And it's now recognized as a result of some extensive research, and we'll talk a little bit later about the ACEs study, that trauma is a major public health issue. And it affects people emotionally, mentally, physically in a number of ways. And it impacts individuals, it impacts families, and they've also found that it impacts communities. And so given the enormous impact that it has on health outcomes, it's really critical for organizations to look at the people that they serve and just have a basic understanding, first of all, of what trauma is, what the symptoms might be that individuals who experience trauma might display, and then what can you do in the context of whatever organization that you serve what can you do to help to minimize the impact of trauma and to provide a more supportive environment for everyone. And they have found, really based on the statistics, that trauma is so prevalent that service providers should assume that many of the individuals that you come into contact with in the course of work and the services that you provide has been touched in some way and in some way impacted by trauma. And true trauma-informed care also looks at the work environment and the employees. And so not only looking at the individuals that you serve, but also looking at your coworkers and reflecting on your own life and maybe some of the adverse experiences that you have experienced. And with that being said, I just want to take a moment to recognize that this can be a difficult topic for some people. And sometimes you go in with your professional hat on thinking, oh, this is about work and this is about the people that I serve. But very quickly, this topic can actually evoke some traumatic responses from some people. And so I just want to encourage you, if this happens, to feel free to step away. You can always come back. If there's something you want to process about it or ask about later, my email is actually attached where you see my picture, so feel free to contact me if you need to talk some more about that. But let's start by looking at trauma as it's defined by SAMHSA. And SAMHSA, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And it's they define trauma as an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So you see, that's a really heavy, weighty definition, but it does show you that trauma is very extensive and that it impacts individuals in many different ways and forms. So I want to give you a little bit of a context of some of the terms that are used, the distinctions between the different types of trauma, just because if you haven't had the background, and I appreciate that some of you, it looks like, have had extensive training in trauma-informed care, and I appreciate you joining us, and I hope that in the end, when we have discussion and questions, that you would contribute if you have experiences to add or information in terms of how you've applied that to your work. But acute trauma is typically a single event that is limited in time, and it's something that a wide variety of people might experience, and they're typically things that a lot of people would also recognize as a traumatic event. So it's serious accidents, it's community violence when it occurs maybe one time where you witness something that you don't witness every day. We'll talk a little bit later about a different type of trauma that would be somebody who's actually raised in a community of violence. But natural disasters, sudden or violent loss of a loved one or somebody getting hurt. It includes all different types of assault. And this is just a small sample of some of the things that are acute trauma. But basically, what distinguishes acute trauma from some of the more chronic or complex trauma or pervasive trauma is that acute trauma is something that happens, and typically the individual is able to garner together the resources to heal from that, to recover from that. Oftentimes, these things are acknowledged as being traumatic experiences, so the support network kicks in, and for a lot of people, individuals, especially those who have a good support system, tend to recover pretty easily from these traumas. Now, not to say that there wouldn't be a long-term need to process emotions. There can sometimes be anxiety, depression, other symptoms related to this, but they wouldn't necessarily result in what we would see as a traumatic response. Like, it wouldn't necessarily be something that would show up years and years later in their interactions with individuals in the service setting. So when you think about individuals that you know that have been traumatized, a lot of times people wonder, what is the difference between individuals? Like, what makes an event traumatic, and why can two people go through the same experience, maybe two siblings who live through the same event, or you look at these some of these mass tragedies that are just these heinous crimes, and you see lots of different people go through them, and some people are really, really significantly impacted, and some people seem to be fairly resilient. And what they've found through some of the resilience research, and resilience in essence is the ability to go through adverse experiences and recover from it, heal from it. And so what they have found in looking at this is that the things that make a difference tend to be factors like the type of exposure. Did you see the event directly? Were you close to the event? Is it something that you saw from far away? Is it something that happened within the context of your family? Also, another huge factor is your age and developmental stage during exposure. And it used to be that it was thought that if a child experienced trauma, that oftentimes what you'll see with children is they tend to go on with life really quickly, and people thought, oh, they just bounce back and they won't remember that trauma. We don't need to talk about it later. They're okay. And what they're finding is that sometimes traumatic experiences from childhood that occurred in those early developmental stages show up in other ways later on. But if you're not if you're not equipped with the skills to know what to look for, you might not really recognize that it's connected to the trauma. So children absolutely are impacted by trauma, and the exposure at one point in development can sometimes have an impact on their brain development. And that's a really scary thought. And that's one of the things that the ACEs has really shaped in terms of looking at the impact of adverse childhood experiences and the health outcomes of individuals, that some of them can be lifelong. So also, how chronic was it, and what kind of social support, what kind of context did the event occur in? Different cultures have different ways of making meaning and responding to and healing from trauma. For example, if you look at grieving and how it's handled differently in different cultures, some cultures have very extensive traditions and rituals that follow grief and loss. So if somebody passes away, it may be built into their culture that they have months or even sometimes a year to mourn, and for other people to recognize there's a mourning process. And so that in some ways can be a very healing culture, because everybody around you is recognizing that this isn't just something you get over quickly. Also, the family we're shaped in really impacts how we deal with trauma. Is it something that people talk about? Is it something that people keep a secret? Is it something that there's shame attached to? The community, for the same reasons, has the same impact. And then looking at the presence and absence of additional vulnerabilities. In the field, there's this term called intersectionality that I'm hearing in more and more contexts. And basically what it means is you look at whatever factor you're looking at, whatever risk factor, in this case it would be exposure to trauma, you look at how that also comes into contact with other risk factors. So it kind of magnifies, sometimes it layers on top of the other things, and it can have a more devastating impact on individuals who have multiple layers of these risk factors. And so individuals who have disabilities are known to be impacted by trauma, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but tend to be a vulnerable population. We know that youth from the juvenile justice population are, I believe the statistic that I saw recently was 94% of them are reporting that they have had some kind of traumatic exposure. So we know that's a huge population where there would be a greater risk of trauma for a variety of different reasons. So different vulnerabilities can, based on resources that individuals have and other factors, can really shape how they respond and recover to trauma. And we know also that resources, what's available in terms of helping the individual to recover from that trauma, is significant. So the framework that is often applied to understanding trauma is kind of this trifold of looking at, first of all, the event. So by definition, trauma requires an event. And so that event could be something that a wide variety of people would say would be traumatic. So it could be witnessing an act of violence that resulted in death or some kind of dramatic injury. That would be something that a wide variety of people would say, yes, if somebody witnessed that directly, that would result in a traumatic response. Now, other situations may be viewed as traumatic by one individual, but not by another. So take, for example, divorce. There are a large percentage of individuals who've experienced divorce, either directly or within their family. And some people report that as being a very, very traumatic period of either their childhood or their adulthood, if they went through that in their own marriage. And other people would say no, that it did not impact them, and they did not need to receive counseling. They didn't feel that it was a traumatic event. So really the event has to be defined by the person. The experience, and that's the second part, the experience is that part where we have to really look at the perception. Trauma is really based in the perception and the meaning that the person has of it. So I can't tell somebody what's traumatic. And I have had situations where families have brought, with good intentions, have brought youth to me and said, look, my child went through X, Y, and Z, and they need counseling because they are suffering from this. And when speaking alone with the youth, sometimes for a variety of different reasons, I find out pretty quickly that they don't necessarily need to receive, at least not talk therapy for that, because they have not defined it as traumatic, and they can describe to me what they have done to cope with it. And so what I've learned to do is to really look to the person, to ask them how it was defined by them. And the other thing to keep in mind is that there are a wide variety of events that are defined as traumatic in the person's head, that would never be expressed to anybody else, or maybe not expressed for years and years. And I will tell you, there's a high percentage of people that come to counseling even late into their adulthood who will say, you are the first person that I have ever told about this incident. And oftentimes they're incidents that are connected to some sort of shame that they didn't tell their parents, sometimes didn't tell their spouses, even if they have very close marriages and close family relationships. They may not have ever accessed counseling. And so that's just to let you know that there are most likely a wide variety of people that you come into contact with in your professional life and in your personal life who have undergone traumatic experiences, who have never told anybody that they have. Also, the third part is the effects. We look at the variation of effects that it has. People have very different responses physically and emotionally to how they process trauma and how it manifests in terms of symptoms. I mentioned earlier that there was another form of trauma called complex trauma, which would describe somebody who was raised maybe in a violent community or a community experiencing violence. It is often linked to children that are in care. So this is an area that the child welfare community is very, very interested in studying about, because a lot of children have been exposed to this complex trauma, which in that realm is defined as traumatic events that are repetitive and occur over an extended period of time. They undermine primary caregiving relationships and occur during sensitive windows of child development. So oftentimes, when they say they undermine primary caregiving relationships, they impact the child's ability to trust, and they shape the way the child views the world and people, as whether they view them as being safe or unsafe. Because oftentimes, if you're raised in a family where your needs are met and you are you're provided with quality and loving care, you would grow up believing that the world is a safe place in general and that other people are safe. And if you are raised in an environment where there's abuse and neglect, then you may grow up, it really can shift your view of the world, in that you may see others as not being people that you would trust, even if they're your own family or your people that are close to you, that you would think that you would trust otherwise. And the other part of this is that developmental window of time. So you can imagine that a lot of the individuals that you're working with have long histories of experiences, and some of them could include windows of their development in which they experienced some of these events.
This is Kim.
Yes.
Hi. Going back to that last slide, and you hit on exactly what I was going to touch upon, which are the adverse and complex trauma that many of that Opportunity Youth experience repeatedly. And if some of those things are not addressed, I know that we have a lot of folks that are on today that are from workforce and from folk rehab that are charged with helping them develop the skills to be able to become employed. So if those types of things aren't addressed, how can we expect success with these workforce programs?
Well, that's a great question, and I wish there was an easy answer, one size fits all. But I would say, I think one of the crucial parts of healing is the therapeutic alliance that I believe you can develop in any professional setting. And because when you look at this, remember I talked about that this really shapes, when people experience this, it shapes how they view people and it shapes how they view the world. And so I think it really starts with being able to, if you have a youth coming through your door, and they, I think you have to stop and think, you may be the first person that they have ever taken the initiative to approach in the service sector. And it could be, and it's astounding to me how long people will go without accessing services, and that sometimes they may come accessing one thing, but they should have accessed maybe, mental health years earlier and lots of other things, but they're coming to you, they're showing up to you. And I would say, don't lose that opportunity to show them what a healthy, trusting relationship looks like. And that doesn't mean that you have to feel like you have to take ownership of what's going on or that you have to do more than your role requires. It's more of, it's showing them empathy, and it's letting them know that you see them as a person with value and worth. And also, when they feel that about you, they will trust what you say, And I've heard so many people say that the difference in them accessing services and not is that they found somebody that they could trust, who they could say, hey, I need such and such, and that person would help connect them to what they needed. So it might be that they show up and they're not ready for VR services, and there's somebody you can't serve in the moment until some other things are addressed. But what you can do is give them an experience in the half hour or hour that you spend with them, that they recognize that they first of all, you can validate the fact that it took a lot of courage to come to you, but also that because they did that, they do absolutely have the ability and the skills to go do that with somebody else, but they don't have to do it alone, that you can help by giving them some resources and help them to connect to the right services. So there's lots of other things that, we can talk about later on about setting the environment and things to be thinking about with work. But quite honestly, that therapeutic alliance and approach is huge. And I think we can all be mindful of that when we come into contact with people in the service setting.
And that addresses a question that was kind of put in the chat by some of our partners that are in the workforce system that feel that they don't feel equipped to deal with trauma, and that developing a therapeutic alliance seems like it could be a challenge, and they were asking about practical solutions. So I think you mentioned some. Is there anything else that you might?
Well, I think one of them, first and foremost, is kind of a little bit of cognitive therapy to yourself of saying it's okay if being trauma informed and trauma sensitive doesn't mean that you have to be a trauma specific, like a trauma centered agency. It doesn't mean that you have to provide counseling services related to the trauma. What it means basically is it's an awareness that from a physical and emotional standpoint, they're going to be hypervigilant, and coming into your office, they may just feel anxious and stressed and nervous. And so if you find that there's a history of trauma and you don't feel equipped to go where it is, and it may not be appropriate in your setting, it can be like opening up Pandora's box. What you can do is at least kind of partner with them and acknowledge that you recognize that there's something going on that you haven't been trained to help them with, but what you can do is you're committing to helping them to find the resources that can help them. And if you don't have that at your fingertips, you can commit to giving them a phone call back and getting the information and then following up and making sure you connected with the person. So I think I would take that pressure off yourself to be this person to that thinks I can't do anything because I wasn't trained in this, because I think that's the problem, is that individuals are showing up in the society in places where nobody's trained to do this, and it's okay if you don't have the counseling background, but I think we have to at least be equipped to be able to give them an empathetic interaction, and we have to collaborate as professions to work with other agencies in the community so that when somebody does come to us, we know who we can refer them to or what information we can give them. So that's a great question, and I can completely understand that. And we can talk more about that. I hope at the end, we can have a little bit more discussion about what you can do in the VR relationship based on other people's experiences also.
Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Kim. So this is kind of the framework that I applied in looking at today's training, and this comes from SAMHSA's key components. The first step is what we're doing right now is just recognizing that trauma is widespread and it impacts individuals in a variety of ways. It's recognizing if someone maybe gets triggered in your office, like if they start exhibiting a behavior that just seems out of the ordinary, that you start from the standpoint of recognizing this could be a traumatic reaction, even if it looks like something that is a bizarre behavior or something that looks like resistance, there might be something else going on. Also, it responds by integrating this knowledge into policies and practices. And that is going to vary from organization to organization, because what the task is to look at the individuals that come to you. It's to assume that they have been exposed to trauma, and it's to think about, okay, so within our setting, what can we do to make things feel more physically safe, more emotionally safe, and what can we do to just develop a setting where we're not going to re-trigger people by our interactions with them or by the services we provide. And that's the last part, is seeking to actively resist re-traumatization. I mentioned that
before we start this slide, you have a poll that you wanted to pull up on the dimensions of traumatic experiences. So if everybody would take a minute now to read and respond to the poll The Dimensions of Traumatic Experience clinical studies have found that genetics contribute to a heritability factor of what % with the body's ability to process toxic stress. And Aideen, are you going to give us the answer?
Sure. Yeah, the answer is C, which is 30 to 35%. So that's based on studies that looked at, just to explain that a little bit, when we talked about the different factors that impact how, why an event can impact one person or not another person, genetics in terms of what we inherit from family members can come into play 30 to 35% of the time in terms of how susceptible we are to trauma. And there's a whole other field of study that I'm not going to get into, but it's really, really interesting if you like hearing more about the hereditary factors, is epigenetics is really looking at the changes that can happen to genes based on environment. So they look at trauma, what it does to genes, and then how that can then be passed on to future generations because of how genes mutate and are impacted. So that's a really interesting area of study. Thanks, Kim. So adverse childhood experiences, also known as the ACEs, is something you may have been exposed to. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this other than to say that this was really, really something that opened the eyes of the general population of how extensive trauma is. It was a study of 17,000 people, and they found that 2/3 of the people studied reported at least one ACE, which is an adverse childhood experience. And let me tell you what those are in terms of categories. That includes abuse and neglect of multiple different forms. And also the other things are categorized as household dysfunctions. So it includes mental health conditions within family members, incarceration of a family member, substance abuse of a family member, domestic violence, and divorce. And so they looked at this wide variety of different things and had individuals check off, and they found that a wide number of people had experienced at least one, and 12.4% reported 4 or more ACEs, which is pretty significant. But they also made a correlation between the number of ACEs and the increased risk for negative health outcomes. So that's how you see a lot of funding now attached to the ACEs, because they've made a connection between that and things like obesity and early death. It's been linked to high-risk behaviors that lead to health complications. So, for example, people may cope by smoking, or there's a high percentage of people that turn to drug and alcohol. So it leads to other health complications later on, and that includes heart disease, stroke, COPD, obesity, and diabetes. So they're really looking at how they can change some of these factors early on in children's lives so that the health outcomes later are less significant. There has been some research about trauma in individuals with disabilities, both in how frequently they experience them, but also in how we might need to view individuals with disabilities different in terms of the trauma-informed care lens. Because first of all, they are, by some studies, they are more likely to experience trauma. There was a study that indicated that so individuals with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities are 2.9 times as likely to have been physically abused, 5.3% times, and when they say they're comparing to individuals without moderate to severe intellectual disabilities. They're 5.3 times as likely to be neglected and 6.4% times as likely to be sexually abused. But the other things that they have found in doing some studies related to individuals who have experienced trauma and also have disabilities is that sometimes what seem to be benign circumstances and experiences that other people would not even think of as a trauma are experienced as traumatic to individuals with disabilities. So it can include minor transitions. It could include transitioning from one school to another school, which may, from a parental standpoint, seem like a positive change, could be a really difficult transition for another child who lacks the the communication skills to be able to communicate that to others, or maybe even to recognize within themselves that it's a traumatic event, but they absolutely can respond to that. It often comes out in behaviors that are then sometimes misunderstood and are not recognized as being rooted in trauma. Also, the other thing that they have seen is that individuals who have disabilities may have less cognitive coping skills to process what happened, to make sense of it, and then to be able to translate that into communication skills and language to tell other people that something traumatic happened or how it impacted them. And the other thing, which to me, this is the most unfortunate part of it, is that the service system does not recognize individuals with disabilities as experiencing trauma, or does not provide the same kind of follow-up care that we might with individuals that don't have disabilities. And an example of this is when I was working on the New York State Promise Project, I was working with a family in our area who had a child, a teenage daughter who is diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, autism spectrum disorder, and she lost her grandmother, who was basically her co-caregiver with her mother. They had come from another country, and her grandmother stayed home with her mother and helped to care for her, was a significant support in her life. She was very close to her grandmother, and her father was away at work a lot, so her grandmother was more of a caregiver in her daily care than than her father was. And her grandmother passed away suddenly. So her mother went to the pediatrician because the mother, not being from this country, did not know how to access other support systems. And she asked her doctor, who she had a lot of respect for and looked to for advice and counsel, what she should do and how she should talk with her daughter about this. Excuse me. And what the pediatrician said was that she should not talk with her daughter about that, and that it was either, and it's been a while, so I don't remember if it was that the daughter wouldn't understand or just that it would be too upsetting. So the mother took that advice, and not too long after that, her daughter came out of her room and had chopped off her hair. And her mother intuitively knew, and we had a discussion about this, her daughter absolutely felt that loss and grieved that loss and needed to process that loss. And we can all relate to the fact that losing somebody that we love is like losing an appendage. Her grandmother had commented on her hair and how beautiful it was, brushed her hair. There was just such a connection between her hair and her grandmother that this was her way of showing that she was grieving, in the only way that she knew how. And so based on that, her mom and I talked about some ways that she could introduce the topic so that she could help her daughter to, in her own way, to process and talk about the loss. So it's really, really important that we make sure that we recognize that individuals with disabilities, first of all, experience significant emotions from trauma and loss, but also a lot of the same support systems can be adapted. It doesn't, there are some different approaches you use in counseling, and it may not be that they go to cognitive therapy counseling or talk therapy. It may be equine therapy, or it may be some other type of, could be some kind of art therapy or something. But it's really important that we look at resources that help to tap into the feelings and help them to process that in whatever way best matches their communication skills. So we're going to look briefly at the connection between ACEs and work. And I thought this was really interesting because unfortunately, there's not a lot about trauma-informed care and VR counseling in terms of the evidence-based research and directly saying, like, this is exactly what's going to happen. We know that individuals have, it has an impact on employment, and that's actually mentioned in the ACEs. And we know that it increases risk factors that also increase the likelihood that somebody would struggle with employment. But these were some more recent studies. One of them compared those with no ACEs to those with 4 or more, and they were 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed and almost 4 times more likely to report being out of work due to sickness or disability. So it's impacting not only their actual employability, but also how dependable they are at work, how able they are to maintain employment, because it impacts whether or not they're showing up for work. A positive impact of employment, which indicates that we also can demonstrate that there is a positive effect of working when individuals have experienced trauma is that work has been found to be a significant factor in rehabilitation after trauma because it promotes socially productive behaviors and is a pathway to resilience. It helps people to get a new sense of meaning. It helps to connect them with other people, and it helps them to feel like they're contributing to society in a way that people who have been exposed to trauma say that when they have proper supports in place, that work is absolutely healing.
And Aideen, if I could just add, in some of the experiences I've had with VR agencies, sometimes students are referred to VR or even workforce with maybe some mental health challenges, and maybe it's as a direct result of trauma that they've experienced in their lives that maybe hasn't been addressed or is still ongoing. And VR may view it sometimes as they're not work ready. So it's really interesting to see. I can see the benefits of working because a lot of times that's an escape for a lot of us. We can kind of leave what's happening at home and go into a work environment and be surrounded by a different group of people and just immerse ourselves in our work. So I can definitely see the benefits. Can you address that at all in terms of being work ready?
Yeah, I think some of the models. Yeah, some of the models that have been developed and are used in the mental health system in terms of the approach that they take with the IPS model and work is that there's a belief that recovery isn't just a once and done time limited process. Recovery is a process of recognizing that I have some challenges right now. I have some things that I need to get support for, but I also have strengths and I have a purpose and I can still help other people and I can still experience joy and other parts of life in the context of healing. And so it's recognizing that with the proper supports, that it can be dovetailed along with other supports to be a healing plan for individuals. So it might be that the VR counselor is also coordinating with a mental health practitioner, but quite honestly, the mental health field is not very proactive in this area. And a lot of what I've seen in the counseling profession is to tell people that if they're experiencing mental health symptoms, they need to take a break from work. And I think we need to really look at that message that we're sending people, because I think what we need to be promoting is we are promoting support and accessing resources that can help you with that mental health, but we can also, while you're doing that, support the pursuit of work, and we can support an all-encompassing plan that looks at all the areas of your life, because I think that's where we find the meaning that shapes how we recover from trauma, how we recover from mental health symptoms. So yeah, I think that we need to be sensitive to how much work somebody can handle, that it may need to be a transition back into work. Somebody may have difficulty if they're really just dealing with their trauma for the first time and they're being triggered all over the place. It may not be best for them to go back into the workforce in a stressful work environment full time. But what you could do is have a plan for how they can transition into that. Maybe they start part-time. Maybe there's just a time period where they receive some intensive counseling for 3 months, and then after that 3 months they transition into work. It's also looking at workplace accommodations and how we can support them in the environment so that when they're at work, if they get triggered, people around them know how to support them. There's natural supports in place. So I just think there's so many ways we can look at that. Again, because people are experiencing trauma, and it's not just a one-time thing. Right. Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question.
And if you look at the comments, Shanine said it's prudent to note that a certain degree of stability is needed to thrive in a work setting, but that's not without saying also that someone else said, we can't always expect them to be immediately work ready, and that we would have to be definitely having those supports in place and support it as a process. So going in line exactly with what your response was. So thank you.
Yeah, and I would say along with that, I absolutely agree that sometimes I think you have to look at the severity of the symptoms they're having, the frequency of the symptoms, and how much it's impacting their functioning to determine whether they're at a place where they're ready. I think that what we need to be careful of is to just I think there's been a tendency in the medical profession by medical doctors and by mental health practitioners and kind of in general in society to say, well, let's just not even look at work and let's not even talk about it. And sometimes that might be part of their goal. It might be right now we're going to focus on accessing other types of supports, but we're going to talk about what you want to do next. So yeah, I think you have to assess whether they're at a point that work is something that they can pursue now. So this trauma as a new normal came from an article that I read that is referenced in the reference section, but it really was looking at the fact that there are a wide variety of situations where individuals are growing up in environments where trauma is so normalized and has been experienced for their entire lives that they don't even sometimes recognize that they've experienced trauma. And this is something that we can be aware of when we work with individuals that have come from areas that are under-resourced in general, where maybe there was high poverty, high crime, things that put them at greater risk, that it might be kind of normal to have a little bit of fear. And this is sometimes what causes them to drop out of school or causes them to have mistrust because of the experiences that they've had in what they've seen as normal in the relationship between the human service sector and what they've experienced within the community. There can be a lot of distrust and fear associated because of what they've seen, and it becomes just their normal view. And so that's something to be aware of. I'm not going to get into this a lot, but I just wanted you to be familiar with this idea of historical trauma. And this is, the research is really starting to look at how trauma can be passed on from generations to generations. And sometimes you see this in the relation that people have with the service industry and service providers, because there's an initial distrust and anger sometimes. And it's hard for us to pinpoint where that came from, because sometimes it comes from a very young person where you think, okay, they've had a pretty positive experience with me so far, and they've had a positive experience with the school that referred them, and so why is it that they don't trust me? Why is it that they seem fearful or hesitant to access services? And sometimes it's because things have been passed on because of experiences that generations before them have faced, the way that it's shaped their beliefs and their experiences in working with service systems, what they pass on by what they say and by maybe coping behaviors that they have. And so that's something that, again, if you have interest in that, there are some resources that you can look a little bit more at that. So some common responses to trauma are emotionally, there are some things that happen. People can experience fear, anxiety, powerlessness, helplessness, worry, anger. There's a lot of physical or somatic symptoms, nausea, lightheadedness. Some people have panic attacks when they get into certain situations. Behavioral, it can be somebody crying. It could be somebody that's just restless and may appear to be hyperactive. It could be somebody who's unresponsive, who is more dissociative, and they kind of check out and looks like mentally they've just gone someplace else. Cognitively, they can have difficulty with memory, difficulty with detailed information, forgetfulness. So if you think about somebody in the workplace, there are a lot of these areas that you might see it show up at work. So this could give you an indication. If you work with somebody that you know has had a history of trauma, think about the workplace accommodations you could put in place. And for example, some of the same things that you use with an individual who has ADHD are very helpful with individuals who have experienced trauma, breaking things down into small parts and having graphic displays of reminders and cues of how to do things. And so part of it is helping them to just connect with accommodations that recognize some of the ways that trauma has impacted them.
Okay,
and there are a couple of different...
Sorry, we're going to pull up the next poll for you.
Get going and I'm like, ooh.
On recognizing the widespread impact of trauma. So if you would take a minute to respond to recognizing the widespread impact of trauma, what percentage of U.S. youth have been exposed to violence in the past year? Violence includes witnessing violence, assault with a weapon, sexual victimization, child maltreatment, and dating violence. What percentage do you believe? So a good majority think at least 60%. Followed by 75%. Aideen, do you want to share?
Yeah, is the winner. It's 60%, and it is high, but I think maybe not quite as high as I expected. But again, it's all, we know we can look at 10 different studies and get slightly different results in terms of what they find. But it still shows you it's definitely more than half of the population. It shows you the prevalence of violence. So thank you for your responses. You'll see that there's a continuum of the way that people respond and their outward responses to what you might see with trauma. Some people on the one end of the continuum have kind of what they call hyperarousal, where they're in fight or flight all the time, where they have this release of cortisol that's going on in their bodies all the time, and they're prepped for danger. They're ready to react if something happens. And so those are kids that you might see in class that it may be channeled into aggression or defiance. It can be channeled into fidgetiness and having difficulty sitting during class or during a meeting, where they come into a meeting and they're just, sometimes they're the person you can tell they're really, really nervously tapping their foot. So they have all this cortisol flooding through them. And then there's the dissociative response, which looks kind of completely the opposite of that, which looks like somebody who's shut down, somebody who I've had people describe to me that they feel like a robot when they're in this state. They stop themselves from feeling things. And so they may appear really sluggish or slow. These may be individuals who just don't seem engaged in the process at all, and you wonder if they even really care about what's going on. And sometimes that can be a dissociative response where they're just kind of checked out. And again, these are adaptive behaviors to trauma, where these came out of the desire to feel safe and to escape whatever it was that was traumatizing to them.
And Marty has a question, and that's associated with that, Aideen, along the lines of sleeping. And are there trends that you have read about in research regarding sleeping behaviors in people that have a history of trauma?
Yes, and I can't just cite off specific statistics off the top of my head, but what I can tell you is that there is a high degree of sleeping difficulties that come out as nightmares. And that's actually one of the things that you'll see in individuals who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder when it comes to a level that they clinically are diagnosed, and the trauma symptoms have gone on for a long time. And so they can be nightmares at night, they could be flashbacks, but they also may have difficulty sleeping. I think that it tends to be more difficulty with the falling asleep or staying asleep than, as compared to, like, sometimes you'll see with people with depression that they won't ever want to get out of bed. I find that a lot of times people that are dealing with trauma tend to have more difficulty getting their thoughts to shut down. So it's more difficulty with falling and staying asleep. And so they might report their brain racing. They sometimes have fear of going to bed because they know that the nightmares or the flashbacks or the bad thoughts are going to come. So they might stay up for long periods of time and find ways to distract themselves. But yes, sleep can be a real difficulty. So thank you for that question. Some of the thoughts that are going on, if you could read the thought bubbles in people's heads, and I know that some of these occasionally will come out during therapy with some of the things that I do with kids and with teenagers involves having them write out some of these negative thoughts. And some of the things that you'll hear that they would be thinking are, the world is a dangerous place and I'm not safe. Again, this goes back to their early childhood of experiencing trauma in the context of what was supposed to be a secure environment. It could be that they think I'm not good enough, worth enough, smart enough for other people to care about me. So for example, bad things are happening, which kind of ties into the other thing. Only bad things happen, so I won't think about or plan for the future. But also, I'm no good because bad things keep happening to me. And there tends to be, you'll hear people say, like, bad things happen in threes, and I'm just waiting for the next bad thing to happen, or I'm just waiting for the next shoe to drop. So there tends to be a lot of negative thinking associated with it that shapes how they view the world. So I like to visualize this as somebody putting on shades that make everything grim and dark and gray. So instead of seeing your face as being welcoming, you may have the same expression that another person who hadn't experienced would view as welcoming, that an individual who steps into your office who has experienced trauma may see as scary or angry. They may read something because their thinking and the way they view the world is distorted. There's oftentimes difficulty in diagnosing, and that's not to say that sometimes these diagnoses can be tricky because the symptoms could be there of these specific disabilities, of depression, of ADHD, of oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety. But I think what sometimes happens is that they miss the root cause of that, and you can have an individual who gets treated with the typical interventions for whatever that diagnosis is, but because the trauma was never acknowledged, they don't really get healing from the trauma of what started this whole chain of events. So they may still need the other interventions. They may benefit from medication that helps with some of these other disorders, but you may not get to the real root of how did this happen to begin with, that they came to experience some of these things, or it's just highly comorbid where they may be experiencing both, but we need to make sure we're not ignoring the trauma aspect of it. Triggers of trauma can come in a lot of different forms. There's a great book, and it's called The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. It's by Bessel van der Kolk, and I would really recommend, if you're interested in looking at how the body holds on to these things that later are triggered by things within the environment that are sometimes difficult to spot. He really talks a lot about the science behind that. But basically, a trigger is when we're reminded by something. It could be an internal feeling of what we feel inside, or an external thing of something in the environment, and it could be a facial expression. It can be as simple as that you have a voice that sounds similar to a voice of somebody that that did something to hurt them. And it can sometimes be, unfortunately, generalized to an entire gender. So for example, a male may have hurt them, so every time they hear a male voice, they may be triggered. I know that sometimes people will talk about certain smells or certain sounds that are specific to the trauma that they endured. And a lot of times, just to be aware, people don't recognize they've been traumatized, and they don't even maybe remember that was something that comes from the trauma event, but they will experience similar feelings. And so it may just seem like an out of the blue feeling, but it can sometimes be something that comes out of a trigger. You may never find out what the trigger is because it might have happened before the person was able to, it may be from their childhood, and they may not ever have a memory that they could put into words, but their body stored that. So some common triggers, and this is something to be aware of within the VR population, thinking about, kind of put on your lenses of looking at this in terms of, if somebody came into my office, what ways might they experience this? So in what ways could somebody experience a lack of power or control? In what ways might there be unexpected changes that come up that could be a trigger? In what ways might they feel ashamed? That doesn't mean that you're attempting to make them feel shame. It sometimes can be part of disclosing, could be filling out an intake form, could be reporting something that they have to report as part of an intake process, that in reporting it, they feel shame because they have to tell you about it. So these are all some things to be aware of, that if you're in the midst of doing your normal work and somebody starts behaving differently, this helps you to think about whether there could be some kind of connection. Within trauma-informed care, really the paradigm shift has been from what is wrong with you, which is kind of the medical model of, you're coming here, we're going to diagnose you, we're going to give you a label, why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z? And thankfully the field in general of, just all the helping professions are moving away from that approach to a more strength-based approach. But along with that is a more empathetic question of what happened to you, with the assumption that people really generally want to succeed. They want to do well in life. They want people to like them. They want to, we would hope that they want to be employed and have meaning to their life. What happened along the way that made those things difficult? What were those barriers? And so we want to be thinking about organizational policies and other things that could cause somebody to experience, and maybe what is it if we start to see somebody who exhibits a certain behavior. So instead of saying, oh, this person's just resistant to services, what is it that is maybe mirroring what they experienced? And the ways that you look at that, the key principles according to SAMHSA that you can be looking at are safety, and we talked about that, both physical and emotional, trustworthiness, consistency, interpersonal boundaries, How many choices are we giving over power and control along the way? How can we share power with them in the decision-making process? And how are we recognizing their strengths? And the things that the research looked at in terms of qualities that are trauma-informed these are things you can apply to yourself individually and characteristics that you can look at how you can display them to others, but also organizations can exhibit these characteristics. Honesty, predictability, availability, transparency, like when I see you, can I trust you? Is what you're telling me real? Do I really know you and know that I can trust you? Reliability, consistency. And three major needs along with that of trauma survivors are to feel safe, to know what comes next, like predictability. So again, they're not faced with those unpredictable, uncontrolling events that are similar to maybe their traumatic experiences, but also to express their emotions. And I don't mean that in that they have to tell you all their trauma history. What I mean is that could be something as simple as telling you how they feel about the process that you're working on with them, about, you know, searching for employment, or how they feel about the fact that they're coming to you as a youth because their parents are telling them they have to get out of the house, and, you know, this is how they feel about it. So it's validating their feelings in general. It doesn't mean that you have to go to the place where you're counseling them about the trauma.
And Aideen,
so
if I could just
ideas.
Before you start on the next slide, in terms of that previous slide, talk a lot about interagency collaboration, and, you know, oftentimes students with disabilities are connected to a wide variety of resources, and it's all new and daunting, and you know, for individuals who are feeling unsafe or who have experienced trauma, that can be very challenging. So it'd be really critical that the people that are in their lives that they know and trust are making those connections for them, so that they're letting them know this is a safe place, this is a safe person, this is something that is going to benefit you, and helping to make those connections along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will tell you that youth will assess within probably 30 seconds of meeting you whether you're a safe person that they can trust. So it's about, a lot of times, it's not about, what is it? It's not about what you know. It's not, I don't care what you know. I want until I know that you care. So it's making eye contact with them. It's your tone of voice in having just a welcoming, kind of general empathy about you, because when they step into your office and they are looking for these services, when they experience those things, that will be the thing that helps them to say, yes, this is a person who will help me. I've walked in the right door. You want them to say that. Like, you don't want to say to people, you came to the wrong place, because, you know, there's so many ways that subtly gets told to people. And I've even felt that when I go to the doctor and you go for something because you're worried, and they're kind of like, why did you come to me? And I just went for help. I was hurting and I needed help and I went here. You want to think of that approach. They came through your door. What can you do to show them that even if it wasn't the door that directly opens to the service, that you can help them go through another doorway to get them to that service? And so we want them to believe that based on our interactions. It's more about the process of in therapy, it's called, there's the content of what you talk about. So that will be your professional, your information, your set of skills, everything, you know, the X, Y, and Z's about what you were trained for and the information you're passing on to them and the services you're going to give them. And, you know, obviously it's important for you to have those competencies, but what is just as important is for you to connect with them in the process. It's the process that's underneath that. It's facial expression, it's tone of voice, it's how you have your office set up, and whether it seems like you have this big imposing desk that's towering down over them. So it's lots of different things. And kind of leading into that, here are some ways that you can kind of incorporate trauma-informed care into what you might do. And it's following through when you say you're going to do something. It's following up when somebody doesn't expect it, when you didn't have to. When somebody leaves your office and they say, no, I'm not interested, and you could very easily close their case and not have anything to do with them, but instead you call just to say, hey, I just wanted to revisit this conversation with you, or I just wanted to give you the name of another service provider that I thought might be helpful. Because those are the things that help them to know that you heard what they said and help them to connect to maybe the right resource. And sometimes they come back to you months later and they are ready to pursue employment. It's sometimes providing them with tools like visual handouts that help them to know what to expect. It's also maintaining just open and honest communication. These are all the qualities that I had kind of mentioned before about the characteristics, but those are tangible ways you can incorporate it. Another thing to look at is we can all look at how we can influence the system that we work in, either in the smaller organization that we work in or in the larger system, of how we can help individuals with policies and procedures that might be re-triggering to people. What do they feel like when they walk in the door? How do we treat people? And when somebody is triggered by something and they need some flexibility, is our automatic response to be that this is the way we've always done it, so we're not going to change it? And sometimes it is. Sometimes there are rules and regulations, but sometimes there are things that could be changed. But we need to take the time to look at that. And sometimes we need to look at whether the needs of our client, whether they are enough to shift how we're doing things, because there may be another way of doing it that gets us the same end result, but that is more trauma sensitive. It's looking at the different interactions between staff at all levels. So it's not just thinking about, I mean, we're talking about, I've been spending a lot of time talking about VR counselors, but it's also anybody who answers the phone or greets people when they walk in the door. We need to really be looking at organizations at how we can greet people from the time that they first make the phone call to inquire about a service until they finish with the services, where all along the way we are looking at how their safety is being treated and how they're being respected and honored. They looked at, in a study recently, for people who had, they were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, they looked at qualities that they valued in their vocational rehabilitation counselors. And what they found was that they reported that they valued assistance in becoming unstuck, in their words, which meant helping the VR counselor help them to process their feelings, create career goals, and make decisions. They liked having a cheerleader, somebody who saw hope for their future, somebody who helps them to formulate goals. They liked the structure and support, and they liked that somebody was able to help them with some tangible skills and realistic information about finances and their financial future. So again, this kind of looks at the bigger environment about what you can be thinking about, either individually or maybe when you have some staff development opportunities where as staff you're looking at what can we do to be more trauma sensitive. Think about environmental factors, about how you have your lobby and your offices set up, and that can be things like furniture. What they found is, think about if people are hypervigilant, some of the same things I mentioned before that help with individuals with ADHD and other learning disabilities, and things like yoga balls and yoga chairs to sit on, or chairs that move around and wheel around, or just comfortable seating. They make a difference, and they seem like small things, but they're all part of setting the tone of an environment that's not stiff and formal, but one that is welcoming, one that takes into consideration that from a sensory standpoint, people might be hypervigilant and uncomfortable. It's offering them water, having water available. It's attitudes and expressions of the culture. How are they treated by staff? It's relational factors within the process and the way of doing things that could be setting a tone that's not intentional, but may lead to the feeling of loss of control or confusion. So those are the things when we talk about as an organization, even if you're not directly providing trauma-informed services, these are some things that you can be looking at that would still go a long way in helping people who have been traumatized or have experienced trauma. So that brings us to the end of the slides. And so Kim, do we just dovetail into question and answer, or is there something that you want to cover first, or how would you like to proceed from here?
We can open it up for questions, and I thought there were I thought there were a couple more. What I had in here was different, what I had in front of me. So yes, there can be, and I can go through these more quickly, but these are some potential workforce factors that can lead to re-traumatization. This is something to be thinking about if you're sending somebody to the workforce or they're experiencing these things. You may want to provide them, it can be a matter of just accommodations you look for, natural supports you put in place. It could be things that you want to discuss with their potential employer. It's things that you want to just check in with them about
about how they're doing because they could be a trigger if they're entering the workforce after they have experienced trauma. And what you might see if somebody experiences this in the workplace is some similar things that we've mentioned before with being triggered. Somebody could suddenly become verbally assaultive or physically could be defiant, disrespectful. Somebody just shuts down and stops talking, or maybe somebody just completely walks off the workplace, and you get a call from an employer or somebody, an agency you've referred an individual to, and they say, this person doesn't want to work. They did X, Y, and Z, and it may be somehow connected that they were triggered by something in the environment. Sometimes it shows up in regressive behaviors. So suddenly the individual may begin showing childlike behaviors. They may begin rocking. A lot of times the regressive behaviors go back to some kind of regulation. They're trying to internally regulate themselves. And so rocking and things like that, thumb sucking, sometimes you'll see, especially in individuals with disabilities that impact their emotional regulation. And so when you see that happening, here's just some general rules of thumb. When individuals are triggered and they are experiencing a traumatic response, you want to reduce the talking. So you don't want to talk a lot to them because they're having difficulty processing and making sense of language. They may have trouble understanding what you're saying because they're in fight or flight. And they may also have difficulty communicating to you what they need or what they want. What sometimes happens is they become aggressive because they go into fight or flight and they're in the fight mode and they perceive you as a threat. And sometimes I've had people report that they don't even remember afterwards what happened. So they might not normally be somebody who would be aggressive or who would be at risk for harming you physically, but if they're in a dissociative state or they're in a state where they're not accessing the upper parts of their brain, it can be dangerous to touch them or to try to talk to them too much. And you want to communicate safety by just keeping a calm tone of voice, keeping yourself regulated. If you can regulate yourself, imagine yourself as being with a toddler that you are trying to calm down, and those same things that help mothers to calm and fathers and other caregivers to calm down children, of modeling certain ways of breathing and modeling through tone of voice and facial expression. They can be very calming to people who are in a state of panic. And if you can keep yourself regulated and talking calmly and breathing calmly and maybe even walking them through some of those exercises of breathing, that can really help individuals that are triggered. But if nothing else, just if you're not able to, you don't have to coach them if you don't know what to do to help them with breathing or anything. You may offer them a drink of water, you may do something, but I would stop what you're doing in the process of doing the work you're doing and acknowledge that something's happening and that they may need some other type of support, so that you're not just ignoring it and plowing forward. As a general rule of things that you can do that might help to promote more trauma-sensitive interactions, you may want to create some handouts ahead of time that explain the process of, what do you typically go through with individuals when they come into you for the first time? Is there something that could be translated into a handout you could give them? Is there something like agenda mapping that you could use, which is basically taking circles and writing them down of all the different wheelhouses of education and healthcare, and you write down the different supports, and if they have questions, they can jot their questions down, so you can set an agenda with them at the beginning of the meeting of the things they want to talk about. You could have an agenda that you describe to them in the beginning and just let them know this is what we're going to talk about today. And I also want to hear from you if there's something that you want to talk about. And also, do some things like recognize their strengths and celebrate when they keep a job for 3 months or 6 months. Acknowledge that is something that they've done that's impressive. That's something that shows progress and that you saw it and that you are validating it. And I covered the comfortable seating, but the other thing that I wanted to mention about environment is fluorescent lights can be very triggering. And that's to just a wide variety of people. I mean, they can trigger seizures and things like that in some people, but they also can trigger panic attacks. And I have family members that have certain stores that we know if they go into, if they don't wear a hat or something like a visor, that it can trigger, there's something with their eyes that it can physically bring about a panic attack. And so you want to be really sensitive. People that are exposed to trauma are really prone to going into that fight or flight hypervigilance. It sometimes can translate into panic attacks. So I would really kind of look at the lighting and make sure that you don't have some of that fluorescent lighting that can be a trigger for people. And now, now that's the end of the slides. So, so yeah, I'd love to hear some questions and answers, or hear some questions.
Yeah, and going back to the slide on the strategies for responding, you know, a lot of technology nowadays can be used. There's so many calming apps. You know, a lot of people use them to relax, to go to sleep. So there's things I've heard a lot about those being implemented, as well as on the job. Being able to have, say, if there's going through a list of, you know, techniques or things to calm them, and putting that in there, like in their notes, so that they can refer back and say, okay, what are the steps that I'm supposed to do? What are the things that help me calm? Those are some things I've heard being utilized. But yes, now we would love to open it up for questions. And I know we have another poll question here in just a couple minutes that maybe in a couple minutes after a question we can address Jessica. But there is a question from Jessica, and another Jessica, and she asks, is this initiative being offered in the schools? She knows that OMH is there, but a lot of students come to access VR with trauma not being addressed.
And, you know, there are so many different organizations that are trying to integrate trauma-informed care into their services, but it's not really, everybody in their own sector is kind of doing things different ways. It's not really an integrated approach, although there is trauma in general. It is being, there are webinars and lots of different agencies that are providing trauma-informed care in the school setting. So it is definitely a topic that you will see. Unfortunately, it's not like we're all unified, and that what we're doing today, that I can directly tie that into pointing you to the right people who do that. But I do know that, and there's actually some recent, there are some webinars that I downloaded that I kind of keep tucking things away, because there are so many different places that are doing different separate initiatives, that there are some great resources for webinars. Now, how that trickles down to the students is another issue, because I think that it's one thing to get the professional development, but that's a big task for schools, because there are a lot of new staff coming in. And so while it might be something that they have identified as an important initiative, there are gaps in terms of how that trickles down to students really consistently being able to receive that. And I think that's where, you know, we can be trauma, they call them trauma champions, where if it's something that you feel strongly about, we can try to work with, you know, within our realm, do what we can to collaborate with other agencies and sectors and say, hey, how can we work together? Because here's some gaps we see. We have students that are coming to us and they're saying X, Y, and Z. And so it might be at a local level that you're having to locally kind of garner some support for that, but it could be that you offer to, you know, start, maybe you start your own coalition within, you know, you offer to host something to start the conversation. So if you're seeing that it's not done, that's the other thing, is some of these really start at the very grassroots level. But if you want some of those, if anybody's interested in any particular resources that relate to specific topics like the trauma-informed school settings, you can send me an email and let me know what you're looking for, and I can then send you what I have, and that's probably the best way to approach it.
Thank you for that. So why don't we, Jessica, go ahead and pull up the next poll. And everybody take a peek at that and respond to this question. According to the National Center for Education Statistics in 2011, what % of the U.S. population was between the ages of 14 and 24? What % of the population at that time was in that age range? Okay, Adine, I'm going to put it in your wheelhouse.
Hang on, just 1 second. It is, I'm looking at the numbers of where you have it. It is the 15%, which is B, I think it's B, right, labeled B, and it actually, that population, and that's because that's the youth, and you know, there's so much to cover today, but I really do want to just kind of get back to the idea that youth in themselves can be, it can be difficult for them to walk through the doors. And so I think that the population is growing. The population that all of us will be serving in terms of youth is just exponentially growing. And so they were projecting that, you know, it's 15% now, but they say that we can expect that we all need to become much more knowledgeable about how to build that alliance with youth and how to help them to feel safe when they enter our environment, so that they can actually access the service. Because especially youth with disabilities, they are not accessing services. And so we're seeing them go through transition, and they're responsible for the first time for making appointments and arranging things in the community themselves. And there's really a lack of accessing services. And so I think one of the things we can do is look at how can we really address this youth population is getting to be pretty significant within the U.S.
Thank you. Jessica, you can pull down that poll. There is a comment in the chat by Carlene saying that definitely taking advantage of utilizing the school psychologist is one avenue to pursue in the school. And, you know, there's others. You have your local boys and girls clubs, and even reaching out to your Office of Mental Health, whatever your state agency is, to find out what resources and connections they have in your local communities, because there may be something that can be provided in your school or even in the local community. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and I would say also this, the school social workers, and this varies so much. I know even within New York State in terms of what resources are available for school districts, but I know that sometimes there are agencies that are now, like counseling agencies will be housed within schools, and they're starting to have initiatives where they have office space in the schools to make it easier for youth to access them. So they will have those things available to them, and therefore the staff, the counselors that work there, are available to do professional development within the school and to advocate for, you know, just having a trauma-informed environment. But I think I'm thinking of the Mental Health Association sometimes they have staff members that can be supportive to schools. I think every area has different agencies, and so I would think about maybe being creative based on your area. That yeah, we have the school psychologists and social workers, and then outside the school, who would somebody go to if they were accessing services, and can you get those people to come into the school and provide some sort of service? Can you provide them space? Space is a huge thing for practitioners because they have to pay for it. So if you can convince a school to, you know, see individuals on site and provide them office space, those are things, when you get agencies together to collaborate, you can think outside the box. You think about what everybody, you know, what are they looking for outcomes? What resources do they need, and how can we all pool our resources to work together to help youth who have been exposed to trauma?
Are there any questions for Aideen? I know there's a lot of conversation going back and forth, Aideen, and I shared your email address with them as a way for them to reach out to you for some of those resources you mentioned. And if you came on late, up at the top, you can download the PowerPoint and an infograph, the PowerPoint from today with all the information. But since you registered for this webinar, you will receive an email when the recorded version and transcript are available on our website. So you can access the materials that way.
Can I give an example of kind of how trauma came up related to employment with one of our youth?
Yes.
Just to kind of let you know how these are some things that you might be seeing. When I was working on the New York State Promise Project, one of the things that we did in supporting families and youth was to help them with the age 18 redetermination process. And there was a young woman that I went to who was turning 18, who asked me, she and her mom wanted me to sit in with them when they were meeting with the determination officer and providing information. And they went through the standard questions where they were asking, they were functioning questions related to, you know, how does her disability impact her. Now, her disability related to skin grafting and some motor difficulties that she had. What I knew was that the disabilities that she had were actually connected to an accident, which was a fire that she was in when she was a young child. And so they were seeing the physical manifestations of how the disability impacted her. But had I not been there to know to ask the right questions, what their questions would not have gotten at was that she in the workplace was petrified of being near fire. Because there was nothing that triggered her to respond, and maybe they would have assumed from skin grafting, but she would not have articulated without prompting that she did not want to work in a kitchen or near a kitchen, because she wanted to go into the restaurant services was one of her options. And so we needed to let them know that she needed some accommodations related to seeing fire and the fact that fire was a trigger for her. So just kind of interesting how sometimes it's a matter of thinking about maybe the questions that you don't ask, and maybe it's just putting together the dots and recognizing that if someone has a specific disability, maybe there's a trauma behind it there might be something that the normal form wouldn't cover, but it might trigger you to ask an additional question. A lot of times youth they don't necessarily think to report things unless you specifically ask. And the same with any of us, that you're nervous when you're going into a meeting like that, and not necessarily just offering information unless it's asked. So we may just want to be thinking about how within VR, and this is something that I would really be interested in feedback from all of you, is how do you screen for trauma, and is it appropriate to, you know, are there any questions that you could come up with within the VR field that would help you to, help people to maybe report that if it's something significant that you need to know for work, but that doesn't take you in a direction where you feel like you're, staff who work there need to be counseling, or that it triggers this response where it's like opening up Pandora's box. But I think it's just kind of food for thought. How can you, is there an appropriate way to screen for trauma? Because I know the medical community is doing more screening for trauma, and a lot of human service agencies, but some of their jobs are, as part of their intakes are very extensive, and they do full psychosocial histories. And I don't know that I'm not sure whether in your setting, if you get into that kind of depth or really want to get into that depth. So, it's just kind of something to be thinking about. How could you be asking questions that would help you to get that information?
Thank you. We are going to pull up the last polling question, and right after this, we want to alert everybody to kind of draw your attention back to the evaluation slide as a reminder to complete the evaluation, and especially if you're going to be seeking CRC credits, that you complete the evaluation, and then you will reach out to Jessica Fuentes Diaz with your information to seek your credits. So if everybody would take a few minutes right now to respond to this poll. It says, please rate your interest in receiving more training in the area of trauma-informed care. The first option that you can select is, I feel that I have received adequate training to meet the needs of those who have been impacted by trauma, and I don't desire any additional training or resources. The second is, I would like to receive additional resources and training to help me better incorporate trauma-informed care into my professional practices. And the last one is no vote. So it looks like an overwhelming majority would love additional information and resources on this topic.
Thank you all for your feedback. And I would say, I think, I would encourage all of you to just be thinking about, I think it's something that needs to be brought into every sector, just conversation and awareness about it. And so, hopefully maybe I will be able to be part of future resources that you develop. But again, feel free to contact me if there's something that I have that I can pass on to you. I'll certainly do that, and I'll certainly, lend my perspective of working with youth and families. You can share more with me if you feel like I need to know more about the work that you do, and we can kind of talk together about how that could be, how trauma-informed care can really be integrated into VR work. Because I think the field so desperately needs to hear that. We need to have more resources to tell people what you can be doing within your sector to bring that about. So thank you all very much for attending and for listening. And thanks, Kim, for facilitating, and Jessica.
We are very thankful.
Hi everyone, please make sure you complete the participant evaluation to obtain CRC credit. CRC is available for this webinar, so just complete the evaluation and email me, Jessica Fuentes Diaz, at jessicafuentesdiazj@iel.org. Email me your full name and your interest in obtaining this CRC credit. Thank you very much. Goodbye everyone.